The Art Director's Debrief, Special Investigation, Part 3, The Revolutionary Form, A Cloak of Respectability. Hello, and welcome back to the Emotive Archive. In our previous investigations, we have explored the hypocritical world that created Fanny Hill and the incredible journey of its heroine from victim to virtuoso. We have established what the story is about. Today, we will deconstruct how the story is told. For the true radical genius of John Cleland's novel, the very thing that made it so uniquely dangerous and so difficult for the authorities to condemn lies not in its scandalous content, but in its brilliant, subversive, and masterfully crafted literary form. The story of Fanny Hill is a ghost in the machine, a revolutionary soul hiding within the body of a respectable literary genre. In this first part of our analysis, we will dissect the key elements of this form, the radical power of its first-person narrator, and the exquisite, almost alchemical art of its euphemistic language. Let us begin with the most powerful and revolutionary choice Cleland made, the narrator. In the mid-18th century, the novel was still a young and developing art form. The dominant model for a story about a woman's virtue was Samuel Richardson's Pamela, published just 8 years earlier. Pamela is a paragon of virtue, a servant girl whose entire narrative is a chronicle of her successful resistance to the sexual advances of her master. She is a passive heroine whose identity is defined by what she doesn't do. Her voice is one of piety, fear, and ultimate submission to the patriarchal order through a virtuous marriage. She is the acceptable, moral female voice of the age. John Cleland takes this very same narrative structure, the first-person memoir of a young woman, and executes a breathtaking act of literary subversion. He gives this powerful narrative tool not to a virgin, but to a prostitute. This is the first great shock of the novel. For the first time in English literature, the story of a woman of pleasure is told not from the outside, but from the inside. We are not hearing a moralizing sermon from a male author, a detached social critique from a satirist, or a tearful, repentant confession from a fallen woman at the end of her life. We are hearing the confident, articulate, and often humorous voice of Fanny Hill herself, recounting her life with a startling lack of shame. This choice of narrator has a profound effect. It transforms the prostitute from an object into a subject. In the art and literature of the time, the prostitute was a symbol, an object to be pitied, condemned, or desired. She was a body without a voice. Hogarth's prints show us the external tragedy of the harlot's progress, but Cleland takes us inside her mind. We are privy to Fanny's thoughts, her fears, her desires, her calculations, and her philosophical reflections. She is not a passive victim of fate. She is an active agent, a thinking, feeling, and desiring individual who is the author of her own story. She possesses what literary critics call interiority. This act of giving a complex inner life to a figure who was considered almost subhuman by polite society was a radical act of empathy. It forces the reader, whether they are a respectable gentleman or a curious lady, to identify with Fanny, to see the world through her eyes, and to understand the logic and humanity behind her choices. It is a brilliant psychological maneuver that makes it almost impossible for the reader to simply condemn her. We are co-conspirators in her journey, and her lack of guilt becomes our own. The second great pillar of the novel's form is its extraordinary language. Cleland's true genius lies not in what he describes, but in how he describes it. The novel is sexually explicit, yet it contains almost no crude or vulgar words. This is not an accident. It is a deliberate and brilliant artistic strategy. Cleland uses the full, ornate, and often complex vocabulary of 18th century high literature to describe the low subject of sex. He creates an art of euphemism, a poetic and metaphorical language that transforms the physical act into a literary performance. Let us analyze this art of the euphemism. The human body is never described in simple clinical terms. It is described through a series of elaborate, often beautiful metaphors. The penis is a master member, a maypole, a plenipotentiary instrument, or the formidable machine. The vagina is a sensitive plant, the mossy tuft, the affair of affairs, or the favorite port of destination. The act of sex itself is described with the language of exploration, of science, of art, and even of battle. It is a venue of dalliance, a ceremony, or a celebration of the rites of love. This is not the language of a crude pornographer. It is the language of a poet, a philosopher, a man of letters. What is the effect of this highly euphemistic style? First, it creates a crucial aesthetic distance. It allows the reader to engage with the explicit content without feeling that they are reading something merely dirty. The language itself acts as a beautiful, silken veil, obscuring the raw physicality of the act and transforming it into something more abstract, more artistic. It is a performance of wit, a game that both the author and the reader are participating in. It flatters the reader's intelligence, inviting them to decode the metaphors and appreciate the cleverness of the language. It elevates the subject matter by describing the act of sex with the same level of linguistic sophistication that another author might use to describe a beautiful landscape or a philosophical idea. Cleland is making a radical claim that sex, and particularly female pleasure, is a worthy subject of serious artistic exploration. He is arguing that the body and its desires are not a source of shame to be hidden, but a source of wonder and beauty to be celebrated through the highest form of art, which is literature. This combination of a subjective first-person narrator and a highly artistic, euphemistic style is what creates the novel's central ambiguity, the very thing that made it a masterpiece of subversion. It is a book that is constantly performing its own respectability. It is dressed in the fine clothes of the sentimental novel. It speaks with the refined vocabulary of an educated lady, yet it describes a life of utter scandal. This is the cloak of respectability that Cleland wraps around his explosive content. It is a work that is, at every moment, both a work of art and a work of obscenity, and it is impossible to separate the two. This is the brilliant trap that Cleland set for the censors. They could not simply burn it as filth because it was so clearly, so cleverly a work of literature, and they could not praise it as literature because it was so clearly, so undeniably about sex. It was a paradox, a literary monster, and it would take the legal and critical world 200 years to figure out what to do with it.
Now that we have anatomized the two primary tools of Cleland's literary form, the narrator and the language, let us elevate our analysis and explore the deeper structure and philosophy of the work. A traditional reading might dismiss the plot as a simple, episodic string of sexual encounters, but from an art director's perspective, I argue that Fanny Hill possesses a surprisingly rigid and classical structure. Cleland deliberately constructs his novel as a parody, a satirical inversion of one of the most respectable literary genres of his time, the Bildungsroman, or the novel of education. This is the key to understanding the novel's true subversive genius. The Bildungsroman, a genre that was just beginning to take shape in the 18th century, is a story that traces the psychological and moral development of its protagonist from youth to maturity. The hero or heroine starts in a state of innocence, goes through a series of trials and makes a series of mistakes, learns from these experiences, and finally achieves a state of maturity and integration into society. Richardson's Pamela is a perfect example of a female Bildungsroman. Pamela learns to navigate the world, to protect her virtue, and is ultimately rewarded with marriage and a secure place in the social order. Cleland takes this very same structure and creates a transgressive Bildungsroman. Fanny Hill's journey is, from start to finish, an education. She begins as a naive, innocent country girl. She's then thrown into the world of the London brothel, where her education begins. But the curriculum is a complete inversion of a respectable education. She does not learn piety, she learns performance. She does not learn chastity, she learns the art of pleasure. She does not learn domestic skills, she learns economic independence. The various men she encounters are not suitors, they are lessons. Each one teaches her something new about the diversity of human desire, about psychology, and about the mechanics of her trade. Her journey from a common prostitute to a high-class courtesan is a story of professional advancement, of a student becoming a master of her craft. She is, in her own way, a success story, a model of upward mobility. This is a brilliant and deeply satirical argument. Cleland is suggesting that the path of a prostitute, like the path of a respectable lady, is a form of education, a process of learning the rules of society and mastering them to one's own advantage. This leads us to the novel's most radical formal element, the complete absence of a traditional moralizing voice. Fanny's narrative is defined by a shocking lack of guilt. She looks back on her past not with shame or regret, but with the kind of cheerful, philosophical nostalgia. She does not condemn her own actions or the actions of her clients. Instead, she presents them with a non-judgmental, almost scientific curiosity. This is a profound departure from the literary conventions of the time. The 18th century novel was almost always a didactic tool, a vehicle for moral instruction. The narrator, or the author, was expected to act as a moral guide for the reader, clearly distinguishing between virtue and vice, and ensuring that virtue was rewarded and vice was punished. Cleland refuses to do this. By creating a narrator who does not condemn herself, he forces the reader into an uncomfortable position. We are left without a moral compass. We are forced to make our own judgments. Do we condemn Fanny for her actions, or do we admire her for her resilience and her honesty? Do we find her story titillating, or do we find it a sad commentary on the limited options for women? Cleland provides no easy answers. This act of forcing the reader to become the ultimate judge is an incredibly modern literary technique. It anticipates the moral ambiguity of the great 19th century novelists and the reader response theories of the 20th century. It is a profoundly democratic act, suggesting that morality is not a simple top-down decree, but a complex, subjective experience that must be navigated by the individual. This brings us to the final brilliant ambiguity of the work. Its deliberate, masterful balancing act between being a dirty book and a literary work. The novel is a paradox. It is a work of high literary artifice, filled with complex sentences, classical allusions, and philosophical reflections. Yet it is also a catalog of sexual acts. This duality is its greatest defense. When the authorities arrested Cleland, they were faced with a difficult problem. How do you prosecute a book that is, on one hand, clearly obscene, but on the other is written with a level of artistry and intelligence that rivals the most respected novels of the day? It does not fit neatly into any category. It is this very ambiguity, this refusal to be easily defined, that makes it a work of genius. It is a literary chameleon, a shapeshifter that can be read as a simple erotic tale, a sharp social satire, a radical feminist text, or a sophisticated philosophical novel. In conclusion, the literary form of Fanny Hill is not just a container for its scandalous content. It is the very source of its revolutionary power. Through the use of a first-person narrator, an elevated and euphemistic language, the subversion of the Bildungsroman structure, and the refusal of a moralizing tone, John Cleland created a work that was as intellectually provocative as it was sexually explicit. He crafted a respectable, artistic cloak for a story of rebellion, and in doing so,
He created a masterpiece that would challenge the very definitions of literature and obscenity for the next 200 years. Thank you for joining me in the Emotive Archive.